The Russians are putting nukes in space while Israel and Egypt begin an argument over the city of Rafah. Meanwhile, Ukraine is beginning reforms of its military that it hopes will change the course of the war. And we're also going to react to Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin. These stories and more in this edition of the International Affairs News Roundup. First, I want to go ahead and react to the Tucker Carlson interview since this kind of came out before any of these other stories did. And boy, there's a lot to talk about here. Now, first off, I would encourage everybody, especially those of you watching this video, to check out that interview. Now, whatever you really think about Tucker Carlson, I think it is important to try to understand what is going on in the heads of different world leaders, whether you really agree with what they're thinking or not. In this case, we get like a 2-hour interview, basically getting a deep dive into the mind of Vladimir Putin. And boy, is it a confusing and weird place. At the beginning of the interview, boy, it was hilarious. You could tell Tucker Carlson was just confused because he starts asking the question, why did the war in Ukraine start? And he kind of like framed it around how Vladimir Putin had made an assertion that, NATO is preparing to attack Russia.
And you said that you were acting because you had come to the conclusion that the United States, through NATO, might initiate a, quote, surprise attack on our country.
And Putin, just point blank, was like,
It's not that America, the United States, was going to launch a surprise strike on Russia. I didn't say that. Are we having a talk show or a serious conversation?
If it is a serious conversation, then he goes and he says, give me 30 to 60 seconds to do a quick history recap. That takes like 20 to 30 minutes. And the whole time Tucker Carlson is just looking at him like, dude, what are you talking about? It is incredible. And really, the interview does not give you anything new if you've been watching any of the interviews or the speeches that Putin has been giving since the start of the war. This is the worldview that Putin has had, at least for the past few years. And it's really this understanding in his mind that Russia cannot be great unless Ukraine is part of Russia. And in this historical narrative that he paints, really Ukraine has been constantly pulled away from Russia by foreign powers. And he often blames Poland, which I thought was a very interesting thing to note. He even blames Poland for working with the Nazis, which, boy, I would imagine everybody would have a very hard time proving that. But you could tell that Putin was pretty impatient with Carlson for the number of interruptions. As Putin was kind of trying to go through this historical narrative, Carlson was repeatedly saying, like, I don't understand what this has to do with the war in Ukraine. And Putin was constantly just kind of saying, like, dude, I'm talking about it. I'm going to tell you. And then, 10 minutes later, we're at, year 16, whatever. And it's just like, we haven't gone anywhere. One of the interesting things that popped up in the interview was Carlson asked Putin when the last time that he met President Biden was. And Putin said that he couldn't remember. Of course, Tucker kind of pushes back on Putin, saying that, shouldn't this be an important thing to remember? Biden's kind of funding Ukraine. And of course, Putin says, well, look, of course he is. And he kind of downplays that issue. Speaking of Poland, I think it is kind of interesting to note how often Putin refers to Poland. And this has been kind of something that has been going on since the war began and since Putin has been kind of working through this historical narrative about Russia and Ukraine. Tucker Carlson eventually asks, well, are you going to send Russian troops to Poland? And Putin says, only if Russia is attacked. Now, I want to kind of ask a question here. What exactly is an attack, especially in Putin's eyes? And of course, Putin made a point that, the U.S. shouldn't intervene in Russia or Ukraine or Poland because they have domestic issues going on at home. Towards the end of the interview, Tucker Carlson asks about Evan Gershkin, who is a U.S. journalist that is being held as a prisoner in Russia. And Putin really kind of like just pauses, thinks, and then says, well, there's going to have to be something in return, which in effect tells me that Evan Gershkin is basically a hostage right now. This isn't anything new. I mean, you might remember Brittany Griner. That was actually one of the very first YouTube shorts that I posted under my name on YouTube, talking about the exchange between Brittany Griner and the Merchant of Death. This was something that was very unpopular in the US because, of course, the guy's name is the Merchant of Death and you're trading him for a WNBA player. Now, again, any time a US citizen is being held hostage abroad, you got to get them home. It doesn't really matter what the price is, bring them home. And I use that as an example to say that this is not new for Russia. They do, pretty frequently end up using hostages to negotiate either different positions or to negotiate the release of other people that are in U.S. custody. And after all of that interview, at least what I could tell, it seemed like Tucker Carlson did not really get what he came for. It's clear from the jump that he was kind of going into this interview wanting reinforcement for a very specific narrative. And what he ended up getting was pushback not only from Russian press and Russian media. In fact, a lot of his interview was censored in Russia, but he he got a long, lengthy lecture on how Putin views history. I do think that it is incredibly notable how frequently he refers to Poland and how much blame that he places on Poland. A lot of people, since the start of the Ukrainian war, have been kind of discussing the possibility that Russia might basically pivot from Ukraine and attack other parts of Europe like Poland or the Baltic states. I think that there is some credence to that claim because of how Putin has really blamed, Poland for a lot of different things and how he kind of views the Baltic states as a strategic, entity that should belong to Russia. But at the same time, I don't know that I necessarily believe that they will for sure do that. I mean, after all, what army do they have to use right now? If U.S. intelligence reports are true and over 90% of the Russian military is in Ukraine, then yeah, they don't really have a lot left to do anything in the Baltics with. And consider the fact not only that they are all NATO allies in the north, but they are much more militarily sophisticated than Ukraine was at the start of this war. Yeah, it's, Russia's going to have a much more challenging time up in the north than they are in Ukraine, and they have their hands full in Ukraine, let's not get it wrong. Anyway, those are the things that I pulled out of this interview. I do want to hear your thoughts, so comment it below if you've seen that interview. View it with caution. Of course, I think everybody should watch it because, it's good to see, what's going on in the minds of a world leader. A lot of it is kind of grounded in a false understanding of history. So take everything with a grain of salt, as you would do with generally anything. That's generally a good thing to have. Next, the war in Gaza may be entering into its final stage. Israel appears to be preparing to enter the city of Rafah along the southern part of the Gaza Strip. The city of Rafah, which is right along the border between Gaza and Egypt, is becoming very quickly a very strategic point in this conflict, especially as we enter what might be the culmination of this conflict. After Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told the IDF to prepare a plan to enter the city of Rafah, Egypt began to quickly protest the IDF for this plan and began to move heavy equipment into the Sinai along the border. Now, from the IDF perspective, Rafah has become very important because it is where the remainder of the Hamas militant group really appears to be fighting from. However, at the same time, from a humanitarian perspective, there's supposed to be around 1.5 million Palestinians living in that area. That's not a lot of room. I mean, that is way above capacity for the city of Rafah. Consider also that there is a major border crossing into Egypt and how Egypt has been very intentional to say that it does not want Palestinian refugees in the Sinai. This becomes a bit of a tense area. If the IDF moves into the city of Rafah and it creates a surge in dislocated civilians into Egypt, Egypt is not going to be very thrilled. So the IDF has to play this very carefully. At the same time, I don't think that there's much room for the IDF to maneuver really without taking on the city of Rafah and making sure that every Hamas stronghold is taken care of, even if there are no Hamas fighters in the city of Rafah, which may not be likely to be real. There's really not going to be a lot of peace within the minds of the military command and the IDF, knowing that there was one town that they did not clear in southern Gaza. This whole situation has triggered negotiations across various Middle Eastern powers, including Egypt and the United States, to try to really kind of reach another ceasefire to pause fighting and allow the civilians in the area to receive some aid. However, it does still appear that Israel is pretty far off from agreeing to any ceasefire agreement. Exacerbating the situation and really setting the scene for a future military operation, during the night of the Super Bowl, the Israeli Air Force launched a large amount of airstrikes in the city of Rafah, targeting what they believe to be Hamas targets. However, at the same time, these strikes did produce a significant amount of civilian casualties. And of course, with all of this coming closer, Egypt has alarm bells going off. The buildup for Egypt along the border of Gaza is certainly not new. Since the war began, they built up additional border fortifications, intent on making sure that dislocated civilians did not begin to spread into the Sinai Peninsula, which frankly has kind of exacerbated the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. There's really nowhere else for them to go but basically the ocean, which obviously you're not going to go there, or basically into the combat area. So clearly everything here is going extremely well and everybody is extremely happy with each other right now. We've spoken in past videos about how tensions between Israel and Hezbollah could be a very short track to a larger regional conflict. And while at this point, I think we can all agree we're seeing kind of a low-grade regional conflict, especially with, the axis of resistance groups targeting the Americans and the Houthis targeting pretty much everybody. And of course, you have the high-intensity conflict between Israel and Hamas. However, and this is something that I was not really tracking at the beginning, to be honest with you, the conflict between Israel and Hamas could quickly turn into a bit of a dispute between Israel and Egypt. I mean, I saw the military buildup by Egypt along the border of Gaza as a very not chill move. Definitely not something that you would really do if you cared about alleviating the civilian situation going on. Definitely not something that you would do if you cared about alleviating the civilian catastrophe that's going on in Gaza. However, at the same time, I mean, I understand Egypt's concerns with security in the Sinai, even if I'm not necessarily on board. That said, whenever I started seeing the movement of heavy military equipment moving into the Sinai towards the border of Gaza, yeah, that kind of took me by surprise a little bit. I've even seen some concern that Egypt might intervene in Gaza if the IDF were to, in fact, move into the city of Rafah. And I'm going to be honest, guys, that would be an incredibly poor decision. Even right now, Egypt is threatening to void its peace deal with Israel. And that agreement also prohibits Egypt from moving ballistic missiles into the Sinai. So the voiding of that agreement obviously turns what was a demilitarized and rather peaceful front for Israel into a more militarized one that is no longer a guarantee of peace and security. So what exactly happens if the IDF takes over Rafah, and why exactly would they do this right now? Well, like I said, the IDF sees Rafah as the final stronghold for Hamas. And of course, their original objective since the start of the conflict was to completely and utterly destroy Hamas. They're not going to succeed in this until they have done so. And if there's one last town, then there's one last town, and then they're going to clean it through. However, because Israel has been kind of working north down to the south in Gaza, that's really kind of pushed civilians down southward as well. And that brings you to the situation where a small town like Rafah ends up with 1.5 million people approximately in and around the town of Rafah. Of course, we've already said that Egypt does not want dislocated civilians coming from Gaza. And so if the IDF moves into Rafah, I do think that we might see some kind of a response from Egypt, up to and including the withdrawal from the peace agreement, but I don't exactly think that we would just snap to a war. There's a clear way for Israel to clear out the city of Rafah while minimizing civilian casualties. And while we haven't exactly seen them kind of minimize civilian casualties in a lot of their other operations, I think we're getting to a point where they're going to have to really start to operate a heck of a lot slower, especially since there's such a large number of them in this area. However, it would take time, and it would require the IDF to set up a humanitarian corridor going north, allowing these dislocated civilians to move away from the city of Rafah. And once the city is effectively clear of civilians, then they can go in. As the civilians move north of this corridor, that also gives the IDF time to vet the civilians that are passing through the corridor and detain any suspected Hamas fighters. Now, whether this is what they decide to do or not, we will see. Whether they decide to go into Rafah at all, we will see. However, even moving into Rafah slowly and minimizing civilian casualties, that is still not a guarantee that we won't see some kind of response from Egypt. I mean, again, put two different armies in very close proximity to each other where they're not really fans of one another, and one military is in an active conflict. Yeah, that generally tends to lead to some challenges in terms of de-escalation. Things can get out of control pretty quickly if they're not controlled. It'll take a lot of discipline and communication from both the IDF and the Egyptian military, and we're just gonna have to wait and see. So we'll see if they move in, and if they do, we'll certainly talk about it next week or whenever they do, so hit that subscribe button. Now, last week we talked about the news that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had relieved his Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny, and in doing so he replaced him with a new Commander-in-Chief, General Syrsky. Now, the news broke kind of as I was editing that last video, so we didn't have a lot of time to really discuss what had happened. Since then, we've learned more about kind of the changes that Volodymyr Zelensky is wanting to see out of the Ukrainian military going into the end of 2024. So with that, let's discuss how Ukraine is going through a large series of military reforms. These reforms aren't necessarily that detailed, they're more broad stroke and at a strategic level. However, they're also kind of designed to help alleviate nervousness amongst Ukraine's Western backers to see that Ukraine is still actively trying to modernize its military and improve its military situation, so that way Western aid is actually going to the winning side. Right now, Ukraine is facing a lot of challenges, particularly with artillery ammunition. They're being heavily outmatched by Russian artillery at the moment, and one of the strongest areas for the Ukrainian military is with unmanned drones, but really that's not helping the situation around places like, say, Avdiivka, where the Russians have made significant gains over past months. Of course, one of the first things that Zelensky wants to target right now is military corruption, and this is something that hasn't necessarily been new for Ukraine, and it has persisted through the war. However, they have made a lot of changes throughout their military hierarchy to mitigate the impact of corruption. Zelensky also demanded massive changes to Ukraine's military medical system, and this led to the dismissal and replacement of their commander of their medical forces. Of course, one of the top changes was Zelensky's relief of Zaluzhny and replacement with Syrskyi. Now, we talked a little bit last week about Syrskyi and his history and his reputation, so we don't necessarily need to rehash that right now. You can check out that video for that information. Zelensky also called for the integration and reception of more Western modern weapon systems, and for those systems to be distributed all across the frontline units. Now, this is a pretty aggressive goal that is not necessarily in Ukraine's control. We've seen, especially in the United States, issues within Congress that have held up Ukrainian aid. However, Ukraine will have to be more efficient with the equipment that they are receiving, especially logistically, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. Further, Zelensky directed the new commander-in-chief to resolve the logistics issues that are going on within the Ukrainian military. And as a logistician, of course, I'm biased, but logistics is key to victory in warfare. Everything from food, fuel, ammo, reinforcements, spare parts, everything has to arrive in the right place at the right time and the right quantity. And believe it or not, that is incredibly hard, especially whenever you're trying to consider things like enemy action, enemy indirect fire, all of that. Now, we take this for granted, especially as Americans, because we are darn great at logistics. However, it's still hard, and sometimes we struggle with it too. When you're trying to correct the logistics system for an army that is very active in its current war, that wasn't necessarily designed for smooth and speedy logistics, that's going to require a lot of reform. When you're trying to get good logistics out of a military that has decades worth of corruption and is in an active conflict with a militarily superior foe, that's going to be very difficult. Zelensky also called for all of his generals to have an understanding of what's going on along the front line, and this is very important and very critical. Honestly, it should go without saying. The warfighter is the highest priority for any military and any leader, because of course you've got to fight and win the war. And no matter where you are within the military, if you don't understand what's going on along the front line and how your military is doing and what the challenge areas are, you're not going to be able to help out as effectively as you should. Zelensky uses some pretty jarring language here, saying that any general that does not know the front does not serve Ukraine. I think enough said. Zelensky also noted that the number of personnel operating in headquarters needs to be adjusted. Now, this actually made me chuckle as somebody that's worked within a headquarters. It's very easy for a headquarters to become bloated because really every staff needs a whole lot of people, but at the same time you end up with some soldiers hiding out in the headquarters. In high intensity conflicts like this, burnout amongst commanders and their staffs can come incredibly quickly. And that's why the staffs need a decent amount of personnel to be able to help do the work, do the math, do all the different admin stuff that's required for each staff section to better enable the commander to do their job. However, in that pursuit, it can become easy to pull too many people, and that might be something that Zelensky is apparently trying to address right now. We'll of course see how that's done and whether or not that impacts operational efficiency. Zelensky is also calling for an effective rotation system for frontline troops. And this honestly is where I think that things start to get incredibly challenging for Ukraine as it stands right now. And I'll talk about why here in just a moment. Zelensky has also called for improvements to the training regimen for new recruits, calling for an enhanced training program. In fact, he only wants trained soldiers to be on the front line. Now, these last 2 points is where things become incredibly challenging for Ukraine, especially with these reforms, without some type of another round of mobilization. Simply put, there just aren't enough people. For you to have soldiers that you can't really use right now that are on your payroll, that are going through a months-long training regimen perhaps, and you're only limiting the troops that you put on the front line to be the ones that have been through an enhanced training package, while at the same time instituting a rotation to give relief to the soldiers on the front line, that becomes incredibly challenging if you don't have plenty of troops to work with. As it stands right now, it might be incredibly challenging to institute a rotation and to increase training because you have so much frontage. You have 2,000 miles of front line in Ukraine, and that all that frontage has to be heavily manned and prepared for any Russian attack. Consider that U.S. troops receive months to years of training before they enter into combat. These are all good goals for Ukraine. The frontline troops need relief, and of course they need more training, but at the same time, you're going to need more people. None of this was necessarily a huge issue at the beginning of the war because they just needed bodies on the front line quickly. However, as time went on and things began to stabilize, that led to a lot of casualties because of soldiers not really having the intellectual equipment to be able to handle the war. We talk a lot about physical equipment and how that can change the battlefield. The intellectual equipment that you receive in training can also make a huge impact as well. Finally, Zelensky is calling for further development for unmanned systems amongst the military. We've seen drones play a huge role in the war. In fact, we've seen Ukraine sink multiple Russian ships in recent weeks using unmanned drones. We've seen the impact of small FPV drones along the battlefield and how soldiers that are able to quickly reproduce and regenerate their supply of these small drones, they can really gain quick precision with this resource. And while that won't exactly make up for the shortfall in artillery ammunition, it still allows them to put pressure on Russian soldiers. Now, all told, those are the reforms that Zelensky wants to see out of the Ukrainian military in 2024. And it's good to see that Zelensky is taking everything seriously and he's wanting to make some dramatic changes to break the gridlock on the battlefield. However, I've already shared kind of my concerns about mobilization and how it's going to be kind of hard to make this all work with the short supply and personnel that they have as it is. However, I understand that mobilization is currently a politically touchy issue in Ukraine, so I'm just thinking in terms of logistics. Next, Maduro might still be interested in some of that smoke, or is he? Reportedly, Venezuela has been increasing its military presence along the border of Essequibo, which is controlled by Guyana, and it has escalated tensions between the two countries. This, of course, includes a report from a Washington-based think tank that shows the potential development of a Venezuelan military base on the Anacoco Island. And of course, all of this comes as Venezuela and Guyana are deep in their dispute over Essequibo. Now, of course, we've already talked about this whole dispute in previous videos. We're not going to rehash it in this video, so if you want to learn about that, check those videos out because there is some history here. And we'll see if this really means anything at all, because to be honest, I'm not quite sure. I'm reporting on this because we've talked about it in the past and because it's interesting to me, but at the same time, I'm holding to my previous analysis that Maduro's just trying to look strong. And nothing really looks stronger as an authoritarian than doing things with your military. And since they've already done their referendum, which basically annexed Essequibo, he's got to keep up appearances and move the Venezuelan military in that direction just to show that he's a strong person. But at the same time, I'm not quite sure that he really wants that smoke, and I don't think that he's going to do anything at all. That said, we'll see. Next, it appears that Starlink is being used by the Russian military, and boy, are people not happy about it, for obvious reasons. A tweet came out showing Russian soldiers opening new Starlink terminal boxes, and they appear to be doing so in occupied Ukraine. This also comes with the accusation that Russia is buying these terminals from Dubai and other third-party countries. After this story gained some traction, Starlink responded saying that they do not operate in Russia, they do not provide service in Russia, and they do not make deals with the Russian government nor its military. In fact, Elon Musk reasserted this claim, saying that he has no knowledge of any dealings with the Russian military and that they will not be participating with the Russian military at all. It also doesn't really help this situation that another image was released showing the RSF in Sudan, which is backed by Wagner, also is using Starlink. Now, so what? Russia might be getting Wi-Fi along the front line, and that's allowing Russian soldiers to get onto Instagram and watch all the different FPV footage of Ukrainian drones bombing their buddies. What's the big deal about this? And why does it actually matter? Well, simply put, the modern battlefield requires networking. And while more sophisticated militaries like the United States will just build their own network on the battlefield, that really requires a lot of time investment and resources to do. You need to build the network, so you got to have the networking equipment that you can make deployable. You've got to issue out the very specific hand equipment for all the different line units that can connect to this network. However, in the case of Ukraine and even in the case of Russia, they found it much easier to just connect to a cell tower or to a satellite, connect to the internet, and coordinate attacks using the internet. Not only is it convenient, but it offers ease of access. Now, that all of that is to say that the Russian military might be accessing this equipment to coordinate attacks along the front line. Now, personally, I'm going to take Starlink's word at this issue, and I know that not everybody will necessarily agree with that determination, because we're not really seeing the Russian military use Starlink in Russia. We're seeing them use it in occupied Ukraine, meaning Ukraine has service and not Russia. And we all know that, of course, the Russian intelligence services are pretty active and sophisticated, and that they can collect Starlink terminals through any number of means, whether clandestine or criminal, and get those terminals to the Russian military when needed. We'll see how long that these terminals actually work. After all, Starlink is probably going to have to identify which terminals they're using and shut them down. However, there's still that open question on how the Russians got those terminals in the first place, but that's probably something that not just I am asking, but probably different law enforcement and intelligence agencies as well. In fact, it wouldn't shock me if we started seeing videos of, Ukrainian intelligence services around the Middle East or, other countries where Russia does business trying to clamp down on these secret Starlink terminal purchases, if that's what's going on. In the meantime, it looks like they're just going to have Wi-Fi. So if you're a Russian soldier that's watching this video from your trench, go home. Just go home. You'll be warm. Finally, there is a critical national security threat that broke on Valentine's Day. National security leadership briefed Congress and released a lot of very alarming statements that really we need to talk about right now. It appears that Russia loves the United States so much that they're wanting to put nuclear weapons in space to target U.S. satellites. Isn't that so sweet? Now, they say that the goal is not to drop nuclear weapons from orbit, but instead to use the nuclear weapons to target telecommunications, internet, and other surveillance satellite assets. Yikes. I'm sure that we're all already at this point familiar with the concept of an EMP, where if a nuclear weapon detonates in space, it could fry electronics on the surface, basically killing the electric grid. There is no shortage of books and research on this phenomenon. After briefing Congress, there were calls from the intelligence community to begin declassifying intelligence on this issue as well, as long as it didn't jeopardize means or methods. In fact, on February 9th, Roscosmos launched a satellite with a classified payload into orbit. Now, I think with all of this, it's clear that we can finally begin to classify Putin as a James Bond villain if we hadn't already. The insane amount of personal wealth, the massive amount of nuclear weapons, his mafia-style leadership, his history with Russia's intelligence community, and his penchant for superweapons, well, it writes itself. Frankly, if Tom Clancy were still around, he should have sued Putin for trying to steal one of his plots. Now, the reporting from the intelligence community doesn't really signal that this is an immediate issue, but it is something that they're going to have to respond to very quickly. And I cannot tell if that is reassuring or not. For all I know, that's a cover for it might already be up there and we don't know it yet. But if they have already put it up there and they do plan on using it sometime, boy, that's not awesome. I don't love that at all. And guys, I'm going to have to come clean. I think it's because the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. Growing up, I always joked that whenever the Chiefs would win the Super Bowl, the world would end. And well, the first time they won it with Mahomes, COVID-19 hit. The second time they won it, and this took a little while, but then the Middle East exploded. Now that they've won it, Russia's putting nukes in space. What are we doing? Which it just kind of sucks because the Chiefs are about to three-peat, so I cannot wait for whatever astronomical calamity befalls the Earth next year. And while I'm kind of joking around right now, this is certainly a serious issue. Ignoring the impacts to the ground that an EMP might have, which are immense. The destruction of a satellite network alone would have devastating impacts for the United States and the Western world, and really the entire world. Not only would that impact telecommunications and the internet, it would also impact GPS, and it would impact the US military and its ability to collect real-time intelligence from space. That is a huge edge that the military has that would be devastating to lose. Now, we're going to kind of wait and see if more intelligence gets released on this in the future. We'll kind of circle back to this in a later video. Hopefully, we don't have to circle back to this because it detonated, because frankly, I don't know how we would put this video on the internet if that happened anyway. I've also seen that this is really all, as far as we can tell, or as far as what's being released to the public, that this is still just an aspirational goal for Russia, meaning that they want to do it, but they haven't done it yet. And I think that that's good news, but at the same time, what's stopping them from doing it? And what exactly can the US do to mitigate the impact or to prevent that from happening? We just need more information on this. So with all of that cheerful news, leave me your thoughts down in the video comments. Leave a like on this video if you found it helpful or informative. I will see you all next time. Later.